All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Kyle, and welcome everyone. So excited to see you all virtually here with us. My name is Harrison Richards. I'm a legislative associate from the Michigan Municipal League, and we are here today to host a technical assistance informative webinar with our friends from Throwe Environmental. We have the National Coastal Resilience Fund grant program, which is currently open. It's a program of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And so this award, which is available over the next 4 years, is going to provide a cumulative 140 million in funding for planning, design, implementation, community resilience, but really looking at some of the events that have happened along our state's coastlines, our state's waterways. And so today we're going to dive a little bit more in depth about this opportunity, talk about some details, and I think there'll be some follow-up breakout sessions too where we can dive a little deeper. So very excited for this, very excited to dive into the content. I will turn it back over to you, Kyle.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So great to see everyone. I'm going to pull some slides up here and we can get started. All right. So everyone seeing the screen, looking good? Perfect. All right. Well, great to see everyone today. Again, my name is Kyle Gray. I am one of the field liaisons from Throwe Environmental that helps conduct outreach across the country for this program, the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So this program is operated by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. You'll hear me referring to the foundation as NFWF and the fund itself as NCRF. Long names, so acronyms tend to do the job here. But we're going to go through what the program is, kind of who our team is and why we're here representing this fund, and then talk about what makes for a competitive proposal in this funding opportunity. So with that, I want to start with who Throwe Environmental is, collectively, and, what we're doing here. So we are a consulting firm based out of Rhode Island that really does a lot of work on climate resilience and climate funding and financing. So through that, that focus area, one of our contracts is with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we've been brought on by the foundation as field liaisons for this funding program. So in that role, we are just broadly promoting the fund and climate resilience as a whole, but more specifically, we're doing that with, direct outreach with folks who might be applying for this funding opportunity. So in cases like this, it can be, a presentation to a work group or with a webinar. And in other instances, we can do, really one-on-one kind of in-depth project-specific discussions with folks who are thinking about applying for funding. So it can be surface level or it can be right in the weeds, really whatever would work best for folks. After applying, we can also provide some feedback on proposals that were not selected for funding, or those that were selected. If they have check-ins and troubleshooting throughout the grant life, we can help with that as well. So we are not the foundation themselves. We are an extension of them, which puts us in an interesting spot because we can tell you all the good stuff about a proposal and kind of be that middleman to share that information. So this program, the National Coastal Resilience Fund, has been administered by NFWF since 2018. So we're on about the 5th or 6th round of funding right now. And historically, it was about $30 or $40 million a year that this funding was available for. Since all of the federal funding that came down through congressional appropriations over the last year, the fund has now gone up about 100 million. So there's 140 million currently available right now for this cycle and for the next 3 cycles after this to invest in coastal resilience projects across the country. And I'll show you in a minute what we mean by coastal resilience, but spoiler alert, it's pretty much all of Michigan. So don't worry if you're not on the shoreline. The odds that you are eligible are upwards of 99%. If you are in the Michigan area. So it is a coastal resilience fund, though. It's all focused on coastal hazards, and I'll explain more what that means in a few minutes. But really, the 2 dual benefits that all projects should be working for, they are community resilience and fish and wildlife benefit. So you'll see in capital letters, we've got "and" here. All projects should enhance community resilience and fish and wildlife habitat, not one or the other. An interesting thing about this program is that because it's going through NFWF, we're able to leverage public-private partnerships. NFWF is one of those, quasi-governmental agencies. So they get money from the feds, organizations or agencies like NOAA and DOD, but a lot of the funding also comes from different private partnerships that you see on screen as well. So they're able to leverage those public-private connections, all in the benefit of enhancing conservation outcomes across the country. So I touched on this briefly, but I want to dive into it a little bit more. This funding program has some must-haves and some should-haves when it comes to the different priorities for funding. So in terms of the must-haves, all projects that are coming in, every proposal that's coming into this program really should utilize nature-based solutions. So those solutions will look different across the country. In some places, those will be, shoreline restoration, there'll be dune enhancement. In other areas, we'll be looking, if we're talking about Alaska, we're talking about permafrost melt, so projects that deal with that. If we're looking in the Caribbean and Hawaii, it's coral reef restoration. So it all can be very different depending on where you are in the country. But it should all come down to nature-based solutions that are appropriate for your region and that address coastal hazards. So when we're talking about coastal hazards, that should all be water quantity driven hazards. We're talking flooding, erosion, sea and lake level change, not so much water quality, not focused on pollution or nitrogen runoff, really focused on the amount of water that is coming in from the coast and how that is impacting coastal communities or communities in coastal watersheds. When we get to the community resilience benefit, in this fund, resilience, it's a broad term, but in this fund, it really means the resilience of community infrastructure and community lifelines and assets. So if there are, really vital transportation arteries, roadways, hospitals, schools, critical community infrastructure, whether it's built infrastructure or social, that is where we define community resilience here. So how will the community be able to bounce back with or without that asset in place? And then lastly, a must-have is the Fish and Wildlife benefit. This is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, so that's obviously central to not just this program, but to the organization's mission. So all projects should enhance fish and wildlife benefit and fish and wildlife habitat. And you can demonstrate that through, the different species that are being affected. If there are endangered or listed species, if there are valuable breeding grounds, how your project would positively impact those habitat and those species. That would be very important to include in a proposal. So those are your must-haves. At its core, that's what this program does. The should-haves are what will set proposals apart and what will make yours rise to the top. So I would say these are the things that you should spend just as much time on because this is really what will make your proposal as competitive as possible for funding. So those include things like community impact and engagement. And you'll see as we move forward, there are a couple different categories of funding here. So you can do planning, design, and implementation. And typically the community planning piece tends to have a lot of community engagement, right? That's built into it. But the community engagement and partner engagement should happen throughout the life of a project, whether they're applying in the planning stage or, if they're doing design or constructing the project. So you should always be seeking to engage the community. And in a proposal, you would want to explain how you're doing that, but also how that engagement will really produce meaningful impacts for the project. So are you, engaging the community through workshops? Do they have input on the design? How will that input affect decision-making on the project? And you'd want to explain all of that in a proposal. This fund also has some room for innovative technologies and innovative techniques. So there, of course, you can apply for the tried and true techniques that have been, put in place across the country, and those are still eligible. But knowing that this is a nature-based fund, there is some room for innovative nature-based solutions that help us think differently about the way we're approaching resilience across the country. That kind of ties hand in hand with transferability. So if you're putting together a more innovative project, or say you're putting on the ground an innovative technique that's been used elsewhere, you can really talk about how you are transferring lessons learned either from your project or from another project to produce meaningful resilience impacts at scale. So another way to think about this is if you were a shoreline community and you were looking to, say, restore a few miles of shoreline. In the grand scheme of things, that few miles, it's kind of small at scale, especially with a large national fund. But you can really beef up your proposal and make a more compelling case by talking about how that, small in scale project really has bigger implications, not just across that project area, but maybe across the region. So how would you transfer those lessons learned to other communities that you're partnering with? Or maybe how would you transfer it throughout the region? And I think the Great Lakes is a great place to think about that. You've got 5 different basins. So how would you transfer those lessons learned to other basins and other communities throughout the entire region? And then the last one here we have is sustainability. So all proposals, in order to be competitive, really should think about how your project will be sustainable over time. So we're not looking for projects that just exist in a vacuum. You're not looking to plan or design for the sake of planning and design. We're really looking to put projects on the ground that'll have meaningful impact for the community across the long term. So if you're looking to, do a community resilience plan, how would that plan affect the community 10 years down the road? And how would those projects that come out of that plan actually be implemented? And these are questions that we'd like you to be asking yourself, and questions that, you really should think about putting in your proposal and discussing in that proposal, so reviewers can see that and understand that you've got a long-term view for the project itself. So I kind of teed this up earlier. This is the coastal zone for this program. And as you can see, it's nearly all of Michigan. I will not say that it is all of Michigan because I don't want to be beholden to that, but I think you can tell based on the orange boundary here that it's nearly the entire state. There are some portions up in the Upper Peninsula that you see that are kind of, not covered in orange. I tend to think that's a GIS error. Those are very clearly coastal. So, you luck out as one of the states that is almost entirely covered by this fund. So I would take advantage of that. But technically speaking, we're talking about coastal Huckate watersheds that drain to the ocean or the Great Lakes, and then adjacent Huckate watersheds that are low-lying or tidally influenced. So in order to really determine whether or not you are eligible for this fund, you can scan the QR code, or you can go to the program website and, type in your address, type in the city that you're working in, and it'll zoom you in and show you if you fall within that orange boundary. I think we're safe to say, though, that most of you are just fine with that. So that's geographic eligibility. When it comes to organizational eligibility, we've got the lists here of who can and cannot apply for this funding. So fairly standard players around the eligible category. So we've got state, tribal, territorial, governmental agencies, municipal, regional, local governments are all eligible, nonprofit 501c3s, also educational institutions. So a university could apply. Commercial organizations, if you were working with a consultant or an engineering firm, they can actually be the lead applicant. They don't have to be a contractor that, a municipality brings on. They could put the application in themselves. And then lastly, semi-federal organizations and partnerships as well. That would be something like a Sea grant. You would just want to be careful there around match, especially because you cannot use federal dollars to match federal dollars in this funding program. So you just want to reach out to either our team as the field liaisons or the program team themselves, just to make sure, everything's looking good there. And then in terms of who is not eligible, pretty much anyone coming from a federal agency or anyone outside of the country. It's just a US fund. Also, no unincorporated individuals. You have to be with an organization. So I mentioned these different priority categories, and these are 4 of them, right? There are 4 that you could apply for. You should only pick one of these, and you should narrow it down to which one you're applying for based on the outcome for your project. So if you're thinking about applying and you're at the point where you want money for construction, then you would like to apply for this last funding opportunity, the restoration implementation one. If you're at the beginning of that process and you just need to get a plan in place before you can even move forward, you'd want to apply for community capacity building. So that's how you'd go about approaching making your decision. It's all about where you want to be by the end of the project itself. So the first you can tell is planning level. The last 3 are all very project specific, and they kind of flow into each other. So the planning would then kind of naturally move you on to design and permitting, and then that would naturally move you towards construction. So I want to be clear, though, that pipeline is intended to kind of tee you up and prepare you for the next stage of funding. It does not guarantee multiple stages of funding. So you would have to reapply if, say, you got a preliminary design grant and you wanted to come back for final design. Those would be 2 applications and 2 different grant cycles, potentially one after the other, maybe a few years apart. You would have to reapply for both, though. But they structure it like this for a reason. Whether or not you do get funded, it's really meant to move you towards project implementation. So even if you, say, only get that site assessment grant, from there, you would then be well positioned either through this funding opportunity or another to go after final design funding and then move towards construction. So again, all projects here have to be using nature-based solutions, and they have to be advancing community resilience and fish and wildlife benefits, all in the context of coastal hazards. And again, those are focused on water quantity, not water quality. So flooding, erosion, and lake level change. So we're going to break these down one by one here. So starting with capacity building and planning, this I think is one of the more exciting ones. This is where you can be pretty flexible in what you're proposing. Projects here typically tend to be about 2 years in length. They generally range anywhere from 100,000 up to $1 million, but there is no maximum or minimum for this fund, so you can apply for what you need. But the outcome that you're working towards is a comprehensive resilience plan, and that can look fairly different based on the community. There's no template that you have to work within. Really, you'd really just want to work in some key components of the plan to make sure that it's fitting within the broader goals of the program. So those would include things like, active stakeholder engagement, you're building capacity for the community, you're taking that stakeholder input and it's actually having meaningful, tangible impacts on the project deliverable. And that deliverable itself should be that plan that explores nature-based solutions that can be used to enhance resilience in fish and wildlife habitat. So to be clear, this is not planning just for the sake of planning. It wouldn't just be like a community visioning process. This would be really focused on producing a list of resilience-based, nature-based projects that you could then work towards implementing over, say, the next 5 years or 5 or 10 years. So all project focused, even though it's at the planning stage. The next phase of funding, if you were to apply for this one, is site assessment and preliminary design. And projects here tend to be about a year in length. Again, 100,000 to 1 million is the typical range, but no maximum or minimum. And the outcomes that you're working towards here, they are really focused on preliminary design. So getting to anywhere between 30 and 60% design, or really getting to the spot where you can make a go or no go decision on whether the project moves forward. So that can be through a site assessment, through a feasibility study. It can look different based on your specific project, but the goal here is to be able to decide after this phase whether or not you move forward. And this is, really that first stopping point. Here, projects, in order to get to this phase, projects should have been prioritized elsewhere. So whether that's through a previous grant with NFWF, through that capacity building one that I just covered, or through, say, your hazard mitigation plan, through your community comp plan, whatever it is, it's important that in order to get to this phase, in order to apply for this funding, you should be able to point to another plan where the project that you are doing site assessment for, that project has been identified elsewhere. If you haven't had that project prioritized elsewhere, you probably want to be applying for the capacity building and planning phase. So you can go through that planning process and actually narrow down your highest priorities for resilience. If you have prioritized that though, this is probably one of the better categories for you. And that's where you can start focusing on specific site assessment that's been narrowed down by that planning. And you can start having permitting conversations to move that process forward too. And then there's also some room in this category for baseline monitoring. Proposals should not be, mostly focused on monitoring, but they can include some so that by the time you finish the project, you could compare back and look at that data and understand, if the project has or has not been successful. So this third one here, is a natural extension of the last one. This is final design and permitting. So this is where you would move towards 90 to 100% design, pretty much as close to shovel in the ground as possible without actually putting the shovel in the ground. And projects tend to be about a year or a year and a half in length. Again, about 100,000 to 1 million, no minimum, no maximum. And this is where, permitting should be well underway here. You should be having conversations with permitters, moving those permits along. They don't necessarily need to be completed by the end of the grant, but you should have a really good understanding of the timeline and the lift to understand if they're, if those permits are feasible and what that process would look like. So again, some key components for this one, your project should have been prioritized elsewhere, probably in the planning phase. You should have already gone through that site assessment phase, either through NCRF or not. And this one would really yield a project that is ready for implementation once this grant is over. You can also include some baseline monitoring, just like the last one, to start gathering that data to determine effectiveness at the end of the project. And then the last one, this is the one that everyone likes. This is the exciting one. Restoration and implementation, also known as just, implementation, putting the shovel in the ground. Projects here can be 1 to 10 million. That's the average range, but still no minimum or maximum. They tend to take 2 to 3 years. 3 years tends to be the max. And then there is a year of monitoring afterwards. So that's what I mentioned before. You'd be gathering that data to actually determine effectiveness. The outcome that you're working towards is implementation of the project. So that is the final goal. And this is where the other 3 phases, whether or not you are funded by NCRF, that's where they all come together. So projects should have already been prioritized elsewhere. You should have done all of your designs and your assessments, and you should really have all permits in hand, or almost all of them in hand, and any other approvals that you need so that you can start actually implementing the project. So those are our 4 phases. Again, you're deciding which one is best for you based on the intended outcome. And if you forget what that outcome is, it's right in the name. So that's what you're working towards throughout the entire grant itself. So some other things to consider here. I want to talk about match briefly because that's always a very hot button topic. For this fund, it actually used to be a 1-to-1 match, but over the past 2 cycles with all of this new federal money, non-federal match is actually no longer required. So it's strongly encouraged, and we really tell you, if you can bring match to the table, you should, because it shows a certain level of buy-in and community support. But this program understands that, not everyone can do that. Not every organization has that capacity, and 1-to-1 can be hard to reach. So, be flexible, add match where you can. It can be cash, it can be in kind, it can be volunteer time. If you're working with partner organizations, think about how their volunteer time might be able to count as match, because all of that does show skin in the game, and that really does just enhance the overall success rate of a project. A couple other things that are not priorities. So rebuilds after a storm, after a severe weather event, research projects, and non-natural or gray infrastructure. Those are just not priorities for this fund. For this region too, I mean, the rebuilds are slightly applicable, but I would say the research projects are of note. Making sure that research projects that typically would be led by, academia or the nonprofit sector, they're just not really a good fit for this funding program. They might tee up future funding, but if you're collecting that data and doing that research, it's not as aligned with the planning grant as a resilience or a comprehensive plan might be. Hybrid projects, on the other hand, are acceptable. So obviously sticking with nature-based as much as possible. But if you're working with a nature-based project that has some aspects of non-natural structures, we can call that hybrid, and that could be a good fit depending on the project itself. Reiterating this again, because it's that important, you must be able to show clear benefits to community resilience in the context of flooding, erosion, and lake level change. And you should be able to show clear benefits to fish and wildlife habitat. So that should always be front and center in your proposal. Especially when you're using nature-based solutions, though, you're going to have a lot of different other co-benefits that your project will produce. So maybe if you're doing, shoreline restoration, you're also enhancing recreation opportunities and public access. And all of that is great, and that should be bundled into a proposal. But the resilience and the fish and wildlife benefits should rise to the top every time. Recreation, public access, all of that should be supplemental. They should be co-benefits. They should not be the ones that are at the top of your proposal, because that's going to bury the lead, and it's going to make it harder for the reviewers to find the resilience piece that really is at the core of this program. As I mentioned earlier, priority is given to projects that can demonstrate transferability, innovation, and sustainability. And there's also a priority over the past few cycles to make sure we're meaningfully engaging tribes and underserved communities. So projects that are led by tribes and underserved communities tend to be extra competitive. That's a good fit for this program. So if you have one of those projects, I would encourage you to reach out and chat with us about how to make how to put a proposal together. But especially if you are maybe coming from a nonprofit or a municipality that is not tribally led, or not led by an underserved community, how are you engaging those communities that might be affected by your project? And think about how you're engaging them in a way that actually has tangible impact on the project deliverables. There are two stages for funding for this program, or two stages of application, I should say. And I'll go through the timeline on the last slide. But just to tee this up, there is a pre-proposal that's required, and then a full proposal that's by invite only. So the pre-proposal is due April 12th. It's about 2 to 3 pages in project narrative, so not too long. And that's where you would really lay out what the problem is, what your proposed solution is, and how it hits on these key points that are in this third bullet, right? How you enhance resilience, fish and wildlife habitat, and do so with nature-based solutions. So that's kind of the first stopping point where the program staff can look at this and say, okay, this grant could be within the funding parameters of this program. Then you'd be invited to a full proposal. Those are much longer. It's about 10 to 20 pages of project narrative. And that's where you would be laying out your work plan, your budget, your timeline, and actually, competing for potential funding. And awards tend to be announced in November of the given year. So about 6 or 7 months from now, we would start to hear award notices. All right, so I wanted to give a couple examples of Great Lakes projects here. So this first one is one that we go back to pretty often. It's an exciting one on Cleveland Harbor. So this is the Cleveland Harbor Eastern Embayment Resilience Study, or they call it CHEERS. It was put in by Cleveland Metro Parks, and they've actually been granted twice. So I believe 2019 and 21, they both got awarded. And the first one was a preliminary design grant for $125,000. The second was a final design grant for $985,000. So this is a great example of a pipeline project that came in once, applied for funding, did its thing, waited a year or so to finish its project, and then reapplied to keep moving along in that pipeline. And, based on that, I wouldn't be surprised if they come back again because they are just kind of following that process. So this one was extra competitive because it was creating habitat at scale. They did about 80 acres of in-water and nearshore habitat on the Lake Erie coastline. But it wasn't just habitat benefits. There was also parkland that they were creating to enhance recreation. This offshore park that they were building also had wave attenuation benefits. So they were protecting Interstate 90, which you can see running along the coastline here. So protecting a really valuable transportation artery, benefiting wildlife, and protecting the residents of an underserved community on the other side of that highway. So this one checks a lot of boxes. It's nature-based, it has community resilience benefits, benefits to underserved communities, and we're also enhancing fish and wildlife habitat. So a lot of different components here, and there were tons of partners on this project as well. So engaging different stakeholders. And this is just another view of the same project, but you can see not just the area that they were putting in, the nature-based area, but also the community that was being protected and the highway itself. And then this next one is in Michigan. The project was titled Reduce Storm-Related Impacts for Lake Superior Coastal Communities Through Habitat Restoration. So this one's a little bit older. It was awarded in 2018. So the fund looked a little bit different then, but most of the core elements still stand now. This was awarded to the Superior Watershed Partnership for $2.5 million. The difference here is that this one was a design build project. So they were awarded for funding to design the project and construct it. As the program stands now, we would not encourage that part. We would encourage that to be 2 different grants, one for design, one for construction, but everything else still stands. This was competitive because it was a green-gray hybrid restoration approach. It created almost 40 acres of coastal habitat on the Lake Superior shoreline that did many of the same things that the last project did. It reduced coastal storm impacts to the shoreline and to the roadway running along the shore. And it also enhanced resilience of community resources and brought the public back to the shoreline as well. So I think this is the last slide here, and then we can pause for questions and breakout groups. So this is just, all of the key information that you need leaving this session. So we've got an email that you can reach out to if you've got questions or would like to get some feedback on a specific project. And then we've got some important dates. So there was a webinar for the pre-proposals to kind of get you up to speed on that on March 2nd. And the recording is available on the NFWF website. There is a pre-proposal, as I mentioned, due on April 12th. That's due by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. And after that, the full proposal invitations, once pre-proposals are reviewed, those invitations would go out in the middle to end of May. And then if you're invited to a full proposal, those would be by invite only, and those are due June 28th. So with that, I am going to leave this up on screen for a few minutes, and we can see if there are any questions in the meantime. Let's see, I've got one question here. Not sure. Let's see, 140 million total over 4 years or 140 million each year for the next 4 years? Great question. It is 140 million each year for the next 4 years. So a lot of funding in this one. I mean, there are a lot of other programs out there, but this one definitely scaled up a bit over the last few cycles. And another question, can a community apply for funding to acquire privately owned Great Lakes frontage property for public use? Land acquisition is not typically a priority of this fund. So you could acquire that land with other funding and then use that as match potentially. That would probably be the best approach. There are very, very, very limited circumstances where acquisition could be considered. It is definitely on a case-by-case basis, and those are really only considered if the acquisition is absolutely instrumental to the resilience project itself, emphasis on the resilience piece, and if you've really exhausted all other options to find funding to acquire that land. So if you're kind of just spitballing and not sure if that would be a good fit for yours, odds are it's probably too much of an uphill battle. If you've exhausted all your options and this is really kind of last ditch effort, there may be an opportunity, but like I said, it's really limited. So you would really want to reach out to program staff early to start discussing that. Are inland rivers eligible for shoreline restoration efforts? Good question. Yeah, so there are no restrictions on what type of nature-based projects can happen in that eligible geography. So if you're in that orange boundary, which again is almost the entire state, you're eligible for any of those nature-based projects, that you would be able to put on the ground that would enhance coastal resilience. So there's not a list of projects that you have to choose from, but you do have to be able to make the case that you're enhancing coastal resilience, that you're really working to mitigate coastal hazards, you're making the community more resilient, and you're helping fish and wildlife habitat. So if you can do all of that with shoreline restoration on an inland river that's in that orange zone, that could be eligible. When would funding be available if awarded? Good question. So awards would come out in November of the given year. So you'd probably be notified this November. It typically takes a few months for turnaround. So anywhere probably starting in January or so of the following year, up until June, I think, January to June of 2024 would probably be when funds start to be available. That really depends on how fast you're going back and forth with NFWF though. They really are ready to start moving on that in January of that year. So there's obviously some lag time as you're going back and forth, but the quicker you reply, the quicker things start to happen.
Kyle, Jared had a question above Harry's about the planning stage of the project.
Yeah, Jared, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So I guess just seeking a little bit of clarification on the capacity building and planning stage. So if the purpose of that stage of grant funding is really to identify and define future projects, how important is it that you present potential design concepts and specific project ideas in the application process?
Yeah, that's a good question, Jared. So, I mean, I think the foundation realizes that the whole process of that planning grant is to come up with those designs and ideas. So you would want to give us a general sense of kind of where you're going with that planning, but you don't need to have specific answers or anything yet. That's the point of the grant. So, if you have an inclination that you're doing this plan because you're trying to identify, different spots along the shoreline that need to be restored, and you think it might look like X, Y, and Z, you can include that in your plan or in your proposal. But the planning process is where you would refine that and actually decide if X, Y, and Z are the right fit. So you wouldn't need to go into too much detail about the design since you'd be doing that in the grant and then reporting out on that after you were awarded.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. And I'm going to take the slides down for now here. And I think we've got few enough people in the room where we can probably just stay in this room rather than going into breakouts. Let me take this off here and see. Let's see. So Shanna, Harrisana, Kim, what do you think? Should we switch into rooms or you think we're fine here?
think we're okay in this size group. Yeah.
Yeah, great. All right, we've got 23 minutes, and I mean, this is the time. If you've got project specific ideas or, you know, questions and you're kind of brainstorming things, this is a great time to start asking those questions, because you've got one-on-one with the field liaisons here. So I would say anything that's, you know, bouncing around in your head, feel free to bring it up and we can think through it together.
Before we jump to Kyle, I just noticed there was one more question that populated while we
Yeah.
were talking in the chat.
Yeah, what do you got? Oh, you just put it, okay.
Oh, sorry. It says, is funding available for project costs already completed, for
Oh,
example,
gotcha.
reimbursable?
Yep, thank you. I didn't see that. So great question. There are some restrictions around this. Essentially, the project costs have to be within the period of performance. I would have to go back to the RFP itself, and let me see if I can pull this up while I'm talking here. But they do have to, all costs have to be within the period of performance. If I remember correctly, there's like a 6-month window. But let me see if I can grab this very quickly. So the period of performance is the time between the start and end date of your project for which all activities in the scope of work must be included. So expenses incurred outside of the start and end dates cannot be reimbursed or counted as match. So the greatest possible period of performance, let's see, the project cannot have a start date prior to June 1st, 2023, or an end date after December 31st, 2027. And that's for this cycle. So anything between June of this year and December of 2027 could be counted. That's the maximum project period of performance, but that period of performance would be up to you to determine within that time frame. And just to be clear on that too, this also says any expenses incurred prior to an official award letter and signed contract are taken solely at the risk of the applicant. So, you know, obviously you'd want to make sure you have the grant in hand, or otherwise you're just, you know, putting yourself at a little bit of risk, but it's up to you to determine if that's acceptable or not. And I will put the link to the frequently asked questions in the chat. What I was just reading off of was page 4 under the header period of performance. Kim, did you have something you wanted to say before?
I was just curious if anybody had any projects they wanted to talk about or any ideas that they wanted to share.
Yeah, feel free to unmute or raise your hand. Yeah, Jacqueline, did you want to start us off?
I'll unmute myself instead. Hi. So the village of Marcellus completed in December of 2020 a stormwater asset management plan. Fairly basic. I mean, if we were to fix the entire problem in our entire village, it would be a few $1 million. So this plan our engineer did for us kind of limps us along, and I was wondering if you thought that, you know, we could apply for some of these things in our plan. We have a few of them that we're working on as non-participating with another project. But we have, you know, we've applied for the high water grant for one street. We don't know if we're going to get it, but, you know, we have a couple of places in town where every time it rains, we have lakes. Sometimes the water ends up in people's houses, knock on wood. That hasn't happened in a bit, but it's a real problem. We even have a new building going up and a piece of property over on one part of town, and we're just in the planning commission stages with that right now. But one of the big concerns we have is whatever you do there could potentially send water into the neighbors across the street where it has been before. So I'm wondering, you know, is the village eligible? I mean, I scanned the QR code and I did all that. It looks like we're in the orange area, but I'm wondering if you have suggestions on how we might either do this, or do you think that we should try to get together with the county? I know you're looking favorably on those, you know, collaborative kind of things, but that sets us really far behind if we wanted to start there, because that's kind of at zero.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you tell me, for the stormwater management plan that you mentioned, what were some of the like priority recommendations or projects that came out of that plan?
Okay, hold on, let me get back to the page that I was kind of looking through it here while you were talking.
And while you do that, Jacqueline, I'm also going to just put in the chat for folks the link to the 2023 RFP. So this will be gospel for you if you are looking to apply. I would go back to this time and time again to make sure that what you're putting together is within the bounds of this year's RFP.
Okay.
All right, Jacqueline. So what do you?
So priorities in this are storm inlet. Many of the storm pipes in our road are crushed or, have rusted through and they have holes in them. So we have 12-inch storm that needs replaced, spot lining, water main relocation, which we can actually take out of the project because I think we may be working on that during this water project we're doing, though we have storm inlet issues. Some issues are MDOT, so we may be able to collaborate with them a bit to fix some of their infrastructure as well. So it's just a lot of replacing the storm system that we have and redirecting it away from, this giant lake that happens right here by Village Hall, by the library, and directing it down over to the stream where it eventually ends up. And that was in the high water grant, we proposed to put some rain gardens, or they might have been called rain gardens. I think that was a new one for me. So stuff like that to get the water out of our streets. It's a problem for everybody.
Great. Well, that's helpful to hear. Yeah, go ahead, Kim. I saw you put.
I just put a resource in the chat from New England that was just developed. It's a stormwater retrofit manual. And I think, and Kyle, feel free to chime in, but I think what NFWF would be looking for is replacing that hard pipe structure and disconnecting impervious cover, like typically the stormwater pipes are collecting off of roads.
Yes.
And putting in what we call green infrastructure, which would fit within the nature-based solutions category. So if you're replacing piping, that probably isn't something that NFWF would fund. But if you're replacing the piping with the techniques that are outlined in this retrofit manual, bioswales, rain gardens, infiltration trenches, things of that nature, which are considered green infrastructure, not gray infrastructure, it will be eligible. And I think you have a good start with your stormwater plan, which has identified these areas where there's, problems, and, you could actually go for an additional planning and site evaluation to get a better idea on what the options are at each location that would be eligible through this grant, to maybe take it to like a site assessment level, 30% design, where you'd look at what are the different solutions, but the solutions would have to be nature-based, not replacing the piping.
That makes sense. Okay, so option 2, you're referencing the site assessment and preliminary design.
Yeah, and this retrofit manual was just developed. It's applicable all over the country. It came out of New England at UNH Stormwater Center and VHB Consulting Company, and it's basically how to go in and retrofit areas where the stormwater collection systems are failing or need repair or updating. And so it's a design manual. So I just put that in there as a resource for you. It's definitely applicable in other parts of the country.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I have one more question regarding that. Does this funding cover the cost to apply? So my engineer's time, does it cover that as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say we'd have to go back to the period of performance link that I just put in the chat. So you would only be able to start the period of performance as late as June of this year. So probably not covering the cost of applying.
Okay.
What you might be able to do though is moving forward, you can include staff time, and they understand that you may have to hire, new staff for some of this. So whether or not you have that staff identified, or if you're hiring someone, you could put, slot positions in, whether it was, say, a new program manager or an intern or a graduate assistant, something like that. So you can do staff time, just not outside of the period of performance.
Okay.
And I did want to go back to that last comment on the stormwater plan that you're looking at, Jacqueline. I think everything Kim said, I totally agree with. The only thing I would add to that is that you would just want to make sure in the proposal that you're making it clear that any green infrastructure that you were putting in to, shore up that stormwater system was really, it was being motivated by water quantity and not because you're facing a pollution or a water quality problem. If you were looking to put in those bioswales or rain gardens or, trenches to collect rainwater to infiltrate it and pull out the pollutants, that
Mm.
wouldn't be eligible. But if you're taking in water, so it's not flooding someone's house and it's not flooding the library and the village hall, that
Exactly.
would be much more compelling because that's the water quantity and the flooding problem.
Got
Yeah.
it.
And emphasizing, how it's building a more resilient
Mhm.
amongst the community, trying to quantify like how many people are affected by this, how many roadways, trying to really put that into perspective, because the reviewers would be looking for that information, is how your project would benefit and build resilience in the community.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I see we've got a question from Jared. Jared, do you want to unmute?
Sure. Yeah. So you had mentioned, I guess, both social and built infrastructure. So that's something that's really kind of a high priority for me in thinking about some potential projects where kind of the infrastructure that is highest at risk is more social in the context of tribal resources such as powwow grounds, and then also historic town sites for them, which predate the United States by a significant amount, but not so much things like storm sewers or highways that are at risk. So how does the program value more of that socially based infrastructure, and how would that work in the application process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, it really comes down to the community and how the community, I think, is defining resilience. Obviously, that still has to, it has to gel and align with what the program is thinking. But I would say for those social and those cultural resources, especially when we're thinking about, tribal applications, for tribes specifically, sustenance resources, cultural burial grounds, historic sites, those types of social and cultural resources are considered, resilience and are considered community assets. So
Mhm.
I don't think it's like they're valued at a certain percentage of any other asset. I think it's 1 for 1. They're considered to be community assets.
Mhm.
So I think it would be about making that case of why it's important in your proposal.
Mhm.
So if you were a municipality talking about a social asset, you would just have to demonstrate in that proposal, like how it is important to your community, how protecting this asset does make your community more resilient. And, for some assets that you'll be bringing up, it'll be easier to make that case, and others it might be a little bit harder. Um,
Mhm.
so that's why I use the example of like a road or a highway. I mean, especially if you're a community on a peninsula or an isthmus and you've got one road in and one road out, that can be the difference from getting off of that peninsula or it then being an island.
Mhm.
So it really, I think, is relative to the community. So it's hard to give like a broad answer. I would say it ends up being kind of case by case, but it's up to the applicant to make the case for why that infrastructure, whether it's physical or not, is that important to the community.
Okay.
Yeah, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Miller. I'm with the Michigan Office of Rural Development. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for having this webinar. This is probably by far the best grant webinar I've sat in the last three months or so. So I appreciate that. My question has to do a little bit with the timeline. One of the things that our office is empowered to do is to work with our small and rural communities as they start to think about building capacity towards larger grant projects. Looking at this timeline, it could be a little speedy this year for some of our communities who have need to be able to pull together what they might need to do to be able to apply. And I'm just curious if you anticipate the timeline looking very similar in upcoming years. I know our office will be really interested in helping to kind of spread the word, but also to help support these communities as they're doing some of that pre-thinking, what we like to talk about, where you take your idea to move it to a project, right? And so wherever they're at on your 4 stages, how we can help think and prepare them best to apply.
Yep, great question, especially when it's coming to lower capacity communities. So in terms of the timeline, this is actually an expanded timeline compared to what they usually operate with. So I don't know if we'll stick with this timeline for next cycle. If they do next year what they did last year, it would be a little bit tighter, closer to a month rather than like 7 or 8 weeks, like it is now. And that would be from RFP release to RFP, or the pre-proposal due date. So I would say, whether it's a shorter timeline or like almost the 2 months that we have this year, I would say that the RFP does not change that much year to year. The biggest change was what we saw between 2021 and 22, where there was a huge influx of funding, the match dropped, but what was competitive didn't really change that much. So you can operate off of the previous year's RFP for the most part, just knowing that you might have to shift a little bit when the new year's comes out. So I would say if you have a handful of rural communities that are looking at this, but it's just not going to work this year, spend that time in the off cycle between, April and next January, thinking about what type of proposal those communities might like. And it's really helpful to have one organizing force, to kind of get those folks together. So whether that is your office, because the state can't apply, whether it's a nonprofit, or, some type of intermunicipal collaboration, something like that would be good to get everyone in the room, on one resilience plan. Because they don't typically award to, say, a nonprofit and then have like sub awards or regrants. So you would want one kind of organizing force to get, multiple resilience plans out. But doing that at scale with, 5, 6, 7 rural communities across the state, that's good stuff. And that's what we want when we're talking about scale.
So 2 things just to follow up real quick up of that. One, I will definitely bring that back to our team to think about it from our own standpoint. 2, it does sound like then the January component is something that would be is your typical release time for announcements for the grant. So if we're helping communities think like, hey, get this on your radar for next year, it would be around January, right?
Yeah, so the RFP typically comes out around closer to February. I would start like really going into high gear thinking about it in January though, because it is that expedited timeline. But I would say like this November, right? You'll see the awards, you'll see what was awarded in 2023. So that can give you a sense of, okay, this is what they've invested in Michigan over this past cycle. Think about that. Obviously, it's just hectic around the holidays. So to try to get these meetings is not very realistic. But come the new year, I would say, the RFP is coming out. Program staff at NFWF are already thinking about the RFP. So you can start scheduling meetings with the field liaisons and their staff before the RFP hits the streets. And, they obviously can't tell you anything that's not publicly available yet, but they can start hearing your ideas and give you a sense of if that idea is competitive or not.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Jared, you've got another one?
Yeah. So I know we talked about this a little bit before, Kyle. I'm working in an area where there are kind of severe existing impacts and environmental degradation due to stamp sands. So I'm just thinking about, in water habitat benefits in that context and the benefits that can be derived from using nature-based solutions. So thinking about long-term remediation of stamp sands, that's something that is really difficult to do with an individual project or installing an individual piece of infrastructure. And I guess some of the concepts that, you know, may work as part of an overall strategy to remediate in the long term, in and of themselves, would not necessarily have really any in-water habitat benefits. So for example, one of the problems with stamp sands being a material that has high concentrations of copper, it kills benthic life and it moves around. But, you know, stabilizing that material is the first step towards, you know, being able to control it and remediate. But stabilizing it in and of itself doesn't really solve the problem that this is like a barren area.
Mhm.
So how, just trying to think of how do we kind of quantify habitat benefits when, you know, that's kind of like the first step on the pathway there, but, you know, the long-term goal would be to eventually, you know, stabilize this material, remove pockets of material as needed and where it's appropriate. And down the road, you know, place beach nourishment with clean material, kind of basically isolate and cover up that material and kind of restore it to a more natural state. But that process in and of itself, you know, it could take many, many years to get to the point where you're comfortable, you know, installing that clean material and knowing that it's not going to be immediately negatively impacted by even more existing stamp sands.
Yeah.
So
That's a great question. And obviously we've talked about this, Jared.
Yeah.
It's a, you know, with a problem that's that complex, I think that's where NCRF can be part of the funding landscape. It can't be the only solution here. So I would say the sweet spot for NCRF then, it would be those projects and those sites where you would be able to get that habitat and community resilience benefit.
Mhm.
So the flip side of that is if you don't have a fish and wildlife benefit and there's an intervention that needs to be taken that really, you know, it might stop the degradation that's happening with the sands, but it's not producing that habitat or it's not, you know, overall enhancing the resilience of the community or just one piece of that equation isn't being filled in, then that probably wouldn't be a good fit for this fund because you do have to be able to deliver on the fish and wildlife, the community resilience, and the nature-based. So for this funding, I would say the sweet spot is where you can hit all three of those.
Mhm.
If you're not able to do that, then I would say there's probably, you know, you'd probably have to start looking at other funding sources. And if down the road there was maybe a hard infrastructure intervention that then, you know, opened up the potential for, you know, habitat in a proposal, then maybe you could come back to NCRF. So unfortunately, I think with that type of problem, it becomes kind of a puzzle and you have to work the different funding pieces together. And this is just one example of one of the funds where you've really got to have the community resilience, the fish and wildlife, and the nature based. And if you don't have those three, it probably just wouldn't be competitive.
Yeah. So I guess
Um,
I'm just
Yep,
to
go ahead.
follow up on that. I'm thinking about like the you know, the in-water stabilization may or may not have immediate beneficial impacts in the water. There
Mhm.
would be immediately beneficial impacts to the upland. How do you kind of balance those
Yeah, I mean, I think,
benefits?
yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be in water. So the intervention doesn't necessarily need to have the habitat benefits at that site. So if you could still demonstrate upland habitat creation from, you know, a site that's downstream, that could be viable. That's not, you know, not a non-starter or anything. So I think you would just need to explain that and say, you know, this nature-based solution itself, you know, it is nature-based based on, you know, whatever the engineering is. The habitat's not here, but what this project is doing, it's either causing habitat upstream or downstream. That overall, you know, throughout the entire course of the project is making the community more resilient and is producing that habitat. So you would just have to be able to explain that in a proposal so that the reviewers can see that and understand, okay, this does actually deliver on that fish and wildlife piece.
I guess that's going to be a hard thing to make sure that it is clearly explained in 2 or 3 pages to connect the maybe potentially spatially and temporally distinct infrastructure from benefits.
Yeah, so I would say, and I know we're pretty close on
Yeah.
time here. So I would say that is where it's beneficial to start connecting with the NFWF staff to make sure that you're checking with the programs, the staff itself and the regional leads, so that you're starting to talk to them and they have a good understanding of why that type of project is important and why that intervention would be important for the region. Especially when, making that case might be a little difficult or it might seem a little disconnected. You would want to kind of plant that seed early so they can get a good understanding and they know what to expect, so that when they see this proposal, they're not like, what the heck is this? I'm not seeing how this all plays together. You've already had that conversation.
Mhm.
So I think it would benefit, you'd benefit by just kind of planting the seed early.
Okay.
So
Thank
I
you.
think we're gonna have to cut it there, though. I know we are at 3:02 or 3:03. So I want to toss it back to Harrisana and Shanna. Thank you both for hosting us. I'll put my email in the chat one more time for folks. As a reminder, I'm the Great Lakes Field Liaison Lead, and I can help you think through the proposals themselves. And if I don't have the answers, I can connect you with the NFWF folks who do. So Harrisana, I will send it back to you.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Kim, and just everyone for being here today and for the great feedback and information. Thank you, for you guys to have that amazing presentation of all those details. I think, we at the League talk about capacity very often, and just we recognize how helpful it can be to have this direct time with you all to talk through expectations, outcomes, what different ideas can look like. And as the League, we really try as hard as we can to present any funding opportunity that we get our hands on to our members and highlight that and be able to share, just different opportunities where we can continue to leverage both federal and state funding and do some really hard work from a proactive stance on our coastlines. So as a follow-up, I will be sure to share, again, the information about this award opportunity with everyone, just sharing the deadlines again, knowing that next month some things are coming up. Kyle, when your team is available to do so, because I think we recorded today, right? Yeah.
Yes, we did. Yep. This will be posted within the next probably 48 hours or so. We'll put this up on our YouTube page and then it will be linked to the Throwe site. So you should be able to go back and see this or send it to anyone who didn't.
Awesome. And so we'll include a link to that posting in our follow-up information as well. Shannon, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that covers it. I was just going to say, I appreciate everybody signing on. And if you think that these types of webinars, with agency and partner organizations to talk through some of these funding opportunities is helpful for you, let us know that too, because we're kind of constantly trying to evaluate how we share these kind of opportunities with you in ways that are accessible and digestible. So
yes,
feel free to give us a shout.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Again, enjoy your afternoon, and please feel free to contact any of us if you have any follow-up questions as well.
Thanks, everybody.